Well, hi everybody and welcome. My name is Neil Seidman and I'm co-chair of the Public Education Committee for ADAA. That's the Anxiety and Depression Association of America. And welcome to our webinar. It's entitled, What to Do When Your Kids Won't Let Go. Expert Tips for Overcoming Separation Anxiety. And our presenter is Dr. Rachel Bussman. Now, before we start, I'd like to say just a little bit about ADAA, the Anxiety and Depression Association of America. This is the leading nonprofit organization in the field of anxiety and depression. Our mission is to improve diagnosis and promote the prevention, treatment, and cure of anxiety, depression, and stress-related disorders through education, like this webinar, practice, and research. And one of our most important missions is we work to end stigma and to get the word out. These conditions are very common, they're treatable. And I want to invite everybody to visit the ADAA website. It's a really fantastic resource. That's adaa.org. And one of the things you'll find is a really great list of treatment providers. You just click on the Find a Therapist link from the home page. And in addition, we have a free peer-to-peer online support group. So I want to invite everybody to take advantage of that. And then finally, you can support ADAA by making a charitable donation on the website. So let's get started. I'm really happy to introduce our presenter. Dr. Rachel Bussman is a clinical psychologist. She's the Senior Director of the Anxiety Disorders Center at the Child Mind Institute. Dr. Bussman has extensive experience with cognitive behavioral therapy for children, teens, and young adults that are struggling with anxiety disorders and difficulties at school. She really has special expertise with separation anxiety disorder, also obsessive compulsive disorder, social anxiety disorder, and phobias. And Dr. Bussman has taught and supervised psychiatry residents and child psychiatry fellows, and she lectures on an extensive variety of topics, including the assessment and treatment of anxiety disorders in children and teens. So let me turn it over now to Dr. Bussman, and we'll get her slides to show up in just a moment.
Hopefully that worked.
Yeah, so welcome, Dr. Bussman. So happy to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure. And I definitely think that the ADAA is a wonderful organization and a great resource. So I invite people to look at the website because it's a great resource for getting a lot of information about anxiety and depression. So I'm going to speak today about separation anxiety. And so hopefully you can see the slides that say what to do when your kids won't let go. So we're going to talk about some real practical tips for parents and caregivers regarding separation anxiety. So just a little bit about the Child Mind Institute, which is where I am. We're an independent national nonprofit organization and really dedicated with several missions. So we're based in Manhattan, and we are at the forefront of neuroscience efforts, doing a lot of research and data sharing. We provide clinical care, and we also, like ADAA, have a mission to really disseminate accurate information about anxiety and depression and other mental health disorders and really end stigma. So this is a great joining for us. just in terms
I
of
just before you go on, I just want to just tell the audience that the Child Mind website is just really a wonderful resource.
Thank you. So childmind.org, there's a lot of great resources, much like ADAA, that are free. A lot are downloadable resources for parents and caregivers. So you can look at our website and download things and take them to your pediatrician or take them to your school. So hopefully folks can also check out the website to get some.
So that's childmind.org.
Childmind.org.
Right.
Today, we're going to talk about separation anxiety, and we'll start by talking about what's typical in terms of separation anxiety, and then we'll talk about when it's more cause for concern, and then I think probably the most useful part are we'll talk about some specific strategies that caregivers can use hopefully right away in terms of managing difficult times like for separation, like bedtime or just transitions to school. So I always like to start any conversation about anxiety by talking about what is fear. So fear and the fear response is a really normal and adaptive, meaning a good to have kind of reaction. So it's really important to be able to respond to a danger very quickly. Like crossing a busy street in Manhattan, you want to be alert. Or if a deer, which happens to me in the suburbs, if a deer comes in front of my car, I need to react very quickly and make a decision. Sometimes what happens is when we're particularly anxious, we can kind of get a false alarm signal when there really isn't a danger. And that's kind of what happens with when you have a lot of separation anxiety. And usually what happens when you have anxiety is that there are some thoughts and behaviors and physiologic feelings that occur all kind of at the same time. So we'll talk about that.
If I could just ask you to pause this for a moment. So what I'm hearing is that just the experience of fear and anxiety is basically normal for adults and for young children also.
Really normal. And we would want people to be able to have or be able to react to a threat. Either a child react to a threat or an adult. Because if you don't, then if you don't react to a car that's coming too quickly to you or a deer that's jumping in front of your car, you could get really hurt. So you want to be able to react very quickly, kind of like in my picture here, right? Like this is evolutionary, like we've survived as a species because we were able to get away from danger, either fight the bear or flee. Although I think it's not a good idea to run away from a bear, but that's beside the point. And this is kind of a fancy diagram, but actually a lot of things happen in your body when you're in what's called fight or flight. And it actually explains, and I think is really helpful for adults to hear, that when you feel like your stomach get upset, or when kids complain of stomach aches or headaches or their heart beating when they're nervous, there's a reason for that. Because when we're in a state of fight or flight, when we're faced with a threat, things happen in our body, meaning we divert energy from digesting a hamburger, and you need energy to go to your big muscles in case you need to run, and your pupils change so that you can react to things in your environment. So all that really makes sense. But when we are reacting to a false alarm, it ends up, we still get these physical symptoms, but it feels really uncomfortable and we don't know how to make sense of it. But it actually—
So the fight or flight, the physiological response itself, the fight or flight sensations that you have on this slide is a wonderful slide. It tells about a number of different sensations we might notice. Part of that fight or flight is the way we're designed. So it's supposed to be that way.
It is absolutely supposed to be that way.
We're actually in danger.
Yes, and what happens is after the danger passes, your body sort of resets. So it's not dangerous to have your heartbeat fast and have your breath short or have like tingling in your fingers because the blood is going away from your fingers into the muscles to fight. So when the deer went in front of my car and I reacted really quickly, once the deer safely got to the woods and I resumed driving, my body still felt a little funny. I still was kind of thinking, oh, my heart is racing a little bit. I feel like stomach is a little bit upset, and that's normal because now your body is saying the danger's past and things kind of go back to normal. However, when we're anxious—
So that's the way it's supposed to work.
That's the way it's supposed to work. And it also happens when there's like an anxiety, like we're going to talk about separation. So if a child feels really anxious before they're leaving for school or at bedtime, and they experience some of these stomach upset or heart beating fast, those are actual normal reactions to stress. It's just happening kind of at the wrong time. And we're going to work on later talking about strategies to kind of help that. But it's not dangerous to have that reaction. It's pretty normal when you feel threatened or you feel really in a state of this is really stressful for me.
Good, thank you.
So when we talk about just problem anxiety, or what I mean is anxiety that's more than just typical, often it's unrealistic or out of proportion to the situation. So, right, like dangerous animals, we should stay away from dangerous animals because they could hurt us. But dogs, even though a lot of people might fear dogs, most dogs are probably not super dangerous. And so sometimes when you have a dog phobia, you're having out of proportion fear to something that's not necessarily super dangerous, right?
So what we might call an anxiety disorder or a phobia is when it gets to that point where it becomes a problem.
Exactly.
Out of proportion.
Yep. And all of these different bubbles kind of help you know. And I have a few different versions of what it looks like, but either it's unwanted and uncontrollable. So sometimes kids worry about things that come into their mind. At times they don't want it to worry about it, right? So like, is mom going to pick me up after school? But it's only noon and I go to school every day and I don't really need to worry about that right now. And despite our best efforts, the worry doesn't really go away, and it can sometimes lead to avoidance. For example, I just don't feel like going on play dates because it's just better if I stay near mom or dad. Or maybe I should just sleep on the floor in my parents' room because staying in my room is really uncomfortable.
So what I'm hearing is what you're calling problem anxiety is when that basically normal anxiety reaction, but now it's interfering with valuable parts.
Exactly. And we'll probably talk about later, but it might be a good time to just say that the way we distinguish if something is a problem is really if it's interfering, right? And I think kids have jobs, which is to go to school or to have friends and see them and to do activities. And if
to have fun.
And have fun. And if anxiety isn't getting in the way of doing that job, then it's a problem because kids are supposed to have fun and go to school and see their family and basically think about kid things. And if they worry, it's supposed to kind of come into your mind but dissipate depending on how important that worry is. So now we're going to just back up briefly for a minute. Neil, are you still there? Okay, so I'm going to keep talking. I hope that it's still recording. Yeah. Okay, great, because Neil, I lost you for a second. Yeah, I just can't see you for some reason. But
Are you back?
I can hear you. No, a very funny version of you is showing. Oh, now you're back. Okay. So we're going to back up for a second and just talk about what's considered like typical separation anxiety. So again, separation fears are part of normal development. So it's really normal for infants and then toddlers and even children to have some concerns about separation. And so on this slide kind of talks a little bit about what typical separation anxiety looks like. First, it starts with stranger anxiety. And so a lot of parents know what this is because they'll say something like, my infant used to go to anybody. And then all of a sudden around like 7 or 8 months, then they started crying when I handed them to people. And that's because in the beginning, when you're a teeny infant, there isn't much distinguishing strangers. Yes, infants show preference towards their biological or like primary caregivers very early on, but in general, stranger anxiety sort of shows itself around 7 months and peaks around 12 months. And separation anxiety, which is a little bit different, that's really like, oh my gosh, is my caregiver going to come back? We see that from 18 months to 3 years, which is a huge range. And that's a very normal thing for infants and toddlers to go through this sort of process, I would say, of separation anxiety. And so we're going to talk about what that can look like because it can look like lots of different things. And so here's an example.
Hear me now?
I'm sorry?
Can you hear me now?
I can.
Yeah.
So
good.
Here's a really nice. Oh.
So the point, I just wanted to reinforce your point that these stages of separation anxiety are normal.
Really normal. Yep. Although sometimes really distressing to adults and caregivers, but very normal. And so here's an example. 17-month-old playing in the park with relatives. Mom goes to the car to get something, and it doesn't have to be mom, it could be dad, but often mom. And despite being very comfortable with others, loves the grandma and grandpa, they start to get really distressed. So Johnny or Susie starts to cry and protest and really, where's mom? Like, mama. And then mom comes back and the child's fine. And that's like a really great example of something that's pretty normal. And it can happen at 17 months. It can happen at 12 months. It can also disappear a little bit and then pop back up at certain times. And we'll talk in a minute about when that can happen. And so just continuing this idea that toddlerhood, it's really normal. Children haven't learned how to master interactions with other people. And so they need their caregivers to model that and to essentially model or show through a lot of experience, you'll be okay and I'll return. And we don't necessarily say that, but sometimes we do. Like, mommy's coming back, or daddy will see you at the end of the day, or grandma will be back tomorrow. But separation and sort of navigating what separations are like is something that children need to learn. And it's our job as parents to help them figure out how that works. And so that's
working through these challenges of different levels of separation, it sounds like a really important part of child development, normal child development.
It really is. And I think, and I'm a parent, so I know firsthand that it can be really distressing, right? Especially when you think you've conquered a certain part of development and then it kind of comes back to peek its head up, but that happens sometimes. But it is normal for infants and then toddlers to go through these different stages or moments of peaks and valleys of separation anxiety. And so here are some really key times when you might see peaks in separation anxiety. None of these are going to be very surprising. Meeting a new babysitter, transitioning to new situations like a daycare or school, having a new baby in the house, like a sibling, that's a transition. Times of stress. And that could be stress in the way we think about stress as negative stress, but it could also be things that could be potentially positive, like moving to a new home could be very exciting and fun, but could also be stressful. Play dates can cause a little bit of separation anxiety, and nighttime and sleeping alone. I get a lot of kids in my practice who are older, because we're going to shift now very soon to older kids. So meaning like preschoolers and up. It's not uncommon for children of many ages to struggle with navigating nighttime and sleeping alone. And if you think about it, it's kind of like a big goodbye. You're sort of saying goodbye for the night and I'll see you tomorrow. That's kind of a big separation moment. It's not just like I'm going.
Since you brought that up, Dr. Busman, since you brought that up as an example, we get a lot of questions from parents about, is it okay for my kid to sleep with me?
What a great question. And we could probably have a whole webinar on the answers to that question, but I think, so my answer is, I guess I'm going to separate the part that some families choose to co-sleep as sort of part of their family norm or family culture. And that's not really what I'm going to comment on. What I'll comment on, because I'm an anxiety person, is if your child is sleeping with you because they have anxiety about sleeping alone, or you as the parent have anxiety about them being able to make it through the night in their room, that's probably a good answer to the question of, should they be sleeping with me? And so my answer is, if you want them to sleep with you and sleep with you for a long time, go ahead. But my worry is always when we set habits and patterns, those tend to persist. So what a child is doing at 4, like maybe coming into the room 3 to 4 nights a week and ending half the night in your bed, is not going to the child is probably not going to say, you know what I was thinking? I think I should practice sleeping in my own bed, because that would be a great idea for my separation anxiety. So my long-winded answer is probably not if it's due to anxiety, and there are some strategies to ease that transition to helping your child bravely sleep in their own bed. and having the caregiver bravely tolerate, we can do this.
So what I'm hearing is that meeting the challenge of being able to sleep alone is part of that child development.
Absolutely. And I think it's one of those things that it's much easier if your child is anxious about bedtime to have them sleep with you. Like, that's for sure. It's probably everybody gets more sleep, kind of, and it's an easier in the short term kind of solution, but by no means is it an easy in the long term solution, because I've worked with many middle schoolers who are still sleeping in their parents' room to some extent, and that is hard to solve. So we're going to talk about some strategies for bedtime in a little bit. Great. So here's again, because I like examples and I think they end up being very relevant for parents. So a typical 2-year-old might enter a preschool program and get excited about school, about their backpack, and then get kind of wary and clingy when they enter the classroom. They might even cry at drop-off. So if you're my son, who's now almost 9, but when he was 2.5, crying a little bit at drop-off, this is his example, he kept his coat on throughout the day, even though it was fine to take off your coat, and kind of asking for mommy and daddy a bit. But
and that's normal.
It can definitely be normal. The other key piece is he was engaging in the room, he was looking at stuff, he moved away from the door. But this can be very typical, even for a couple of weeks. And many preschool programs, especially twos programs, don't even venture into full separation until a couple of weeks into the program, right? So some of them have these things called like staged entry, where you stay for an hour and then you stay for an hour and a half, and the parents are down the hall and then they leave. And that's a very purposeful process. So if we see this child 4 months later still crying and unable to really participate at all, maybe they're just kind of wandering, or they're waiting at the door the whole time, and they really aren't sort of navigating and getting over it, that would be more of a concern to me, right? So things
that's interfering now with their development and being able to participate.
Exactly. And that's kind of what we say on the next slide. And I might even have a schematic. I thought I did. But what's different is distinguishing between something that persists. And for separation anxiety disorder, which we're going to talk about in a minute, is often not in toddlers, but really more in the preschool years. And now it's interfering with the child's job, right? So maybe they're not even eating snack at school, or maybe they just are not even looking at the materials, or they're just standing in the doorway. And so when we think about how to diagnose something or put a label to something, which isn't necessarily bad, it really helps us understand what's happening. We look at the duration of the distress and also how much it's interfering with things like making friends and participating in activities. So just to shift the example to, let's say, a kindergartner, they transition to a big change, right, to kindergarten or even middle school. It would be normal for the child to have a little bit of time where they maybe aren't talking as much in the classroom, or a little bit wary, or slow to warm up, or even maybe it takes them a little bit of time to get used to going to the cafeteria and taking their lunch out of the lunchbox. But that kind of stuff should dissipate as the threat dissipates, right? So it's reasonable that starting kindergarten or going to middle school, or, just having a new babysitter is a stressful thing. But for most kids, they navigate that and then kind of come out of it like, this isn't actually threatening, so it's okay for me to relax a little bit.
Yeah, navigating that separation like the preschooler starting preschool, again, sounds like this is normal child development.
Very normal.
Challenges.
So now we're going to shift a little bit to what separation anxiety disorder is, because it's actually different than what separation anxiety is, which can be very confusing for people, right? So I think it's just helpful to be very clear. So separation anxiety disorder is one of the anxiety disorders. So a phobia is an anxiety disorder, or social anxiety is an anxiety disorder, and separation anxiety is when you have 3 or more of these for a persistent period of time. Meaning it's not just like a day or two or 3 or 4 days. Usually an anxiety disorder is at least a few weeks with more days than not. And so some of these key features, and not surprisingly, really intense distress when separation happens or in anticipation of a separation. And often what kids will say is that they're worried about that something bad is going to happen to them or something bad is going to happen to the adult in their life, which this to me is doesn't like make sense that kids would worry about this when they're separated. But usually once you navigate a separation a few times, you probably shouldn't worry, I wonder if my parent is going to pick me up, or what if they forget to get me, or what if I get lost. Like when you've done the separation a bunch of times, those are things that should just be givens, right? Like dismissal happens and I'll get picked up.
Right. But when it persists and keeps feeding on itself and just continues, then that is a clue
Absolutely.
that we might be looking at separation anxiety disorder.
Yeah. And you actually said something really important, which is it feeds on itself, which, and I'll say this now and then I'll continue with the symptoms, which is often what happens, and this is also really normal, is that a child is distressed. And what do we do when our child is distressed? We respond to them because it's really upsetting if they cry or they protest or they say they're scared. In fact, I think Dr. Elie Lebowitz says this beautifully in terms of his take on sort of how we respond to children. They're defenseless, not totally defenseless, but unlike an animal that's born and very quickly can kind of go into the ocean on its own or find food. Children aren't like that. Their way of letting us know that something is wrong is to cry or say, like, help. And so it's normal and natural for us to swoop in and fix the distress, which kind of looks like this. If a kid says, what time are you going to pick me up? And you know that they get very, very distressed unless you go through and tell them where you're going to be, and you promise you're going to be at the particular tree, and you promise you'll get there early, and they will be seeing you the minute they walk out. If you don't give that reassurance, it leads to a lot of upset. So what ends up happening is we tend to say, I'll get there early. In fact, I'll be right at that tree. And what happens is it gives a false sense of security. So the child needs more reassurance rather than saying, you know what, we kind of do this every day. And I know that you're feeling really worried, but I think you know where I'll be and when.
So the reassurance might help the anxiety at that moment. But if my child has separation anxiety disorder, where it's a problem that we have to work on, is that reassurance going to help the child overcome separation anxiety disorder?
Not in the long term. So one of my colleagues, Jerry Bubrick, talks about scratching a mosquito bite. And it feels really amazing when you're scratching it because it relieves the distress. But the minute you stop scratching it, it doesn't. And so
it itches more. Right.
It itches more. So we actually have to learn as adults and kids to tolerate distress and get through it without just trying to say it's fine, we'll make everything better, which is hard. But we'll talk in a little bit about some of those tips and strategies. Okay. And so sometimes kids who are having difficulty with separation anxiety disorder, not surprisingly, either can't go to school, refuse to go to school, visit the nurse and leave early. They might also have a lot of difficulty with navigating bedtime, which is not surprising because we talked about that. Some kids with separation anxiety disorder can't even be in other rooms when their parents are in another room from them. So the idea of going upstairs and getting your pajamas and coming back to the kitchen is a no-go.
So all these last few examples are examples of where the anxiety is interfering with life.
100%. And so not surprisingly, somatic complaints is just a fancy way of saying body concerns. And so
What are some of the most common physical symptoms that a child might have?
Stomach ache, headache, or sort of vague feelings of like feeling unwell, but stomach ache and headache are really common. And to tell parents that it's real. Kids probably do really feel those feelings because their body's kind of in that fight or flight and they're feeling really stressed. And it's not uncommon to have a stomach ache when you're feeling distressed. So these are some of the things that kids might worry about, that the child might be really worried about being abandoned or being just alone. Oh, that should say being alone. Sorry about that. In the first place, or some kind of dangerous event like being kidnapped or being lost and separated. The parent also, separation is kind of a dance. So the parent's role, again, not purposefully, but just because they are distressed about their child's distress, sometimes parents underestimate their child's ability to get through it. So it's kind of this idea like, I don't think my child can handle this. And so it can lead to actually being.
And so I'm not giving my child the chance to do some coping if I think that way.
Right. And kind of we can sometimes end up being like overprotective, even when we don't think we are. Like maybe it's just a good idea if they don't go to the birthday party at all, because I just don't think that that'll be good for them. They might not do well. Right. Or play dates. We should just do play dates at our house because it's so much easier because Johnny just does not do well in new environments.
So there are two things that parents do that maybe in the short run would lower anxiety, but in the long run maybe not be helpful. So the reassurance, and then now what you're talking about now is actually avoiding activities.
Exactly. And if I, and again, if I said to you, you know what, I think subways are dangerous and they're germy and we just shouldn't ride on them because I just feel very distressed about subways. So I'm going to walk because that's a great idea. And then I don't have to really deal with the stress of the subway. That works fine if I don't need to take a subway and if I don't ever plan on getting over that distress. But it's a real problem if, let's say I have a new job and it's very expensive to take taxis, or if it just really, I have to get on a subway. And so I won't be able to get on it if I've been practicing avoiding it for hundreds of times, if that makes sense. So we get really good at practicing not doing things. And so if I said to you, I'm going to get over my subway fear, probably taking a 45-minute subway ride is not going to be the first step. It might just be going and visiting subway stations in the first place, which is kind of similar to how we can help our kids with separations, is we got to help them navigate little steps along the way. So we're going to talk about that a little bit.
Great. So that's an alternative to, if I'm not giving reassurance all the time and I'm not having my child avoid activities, what do I do? And now you're starting to introduce this idea, well, we do it in small steps.
We do it in small steps. So here are some key warning signs that I think parents probably know well. So your child who has some difficulty with separation might exhibit all of these or some of these, but it's not usually one or two, right? Because we talked about interference and duration, and also that kids who have an anxiety disorder don't just exhibit like a little bit of crying. They would exhibit crying and protesting and saying, I don't want to separate. Sometimes kids who have anxiety actually demonstrate what we call like tantrums, or more what sometimes people will label as defiant behavior. And it's important when we see behavior like refusing to like follow a limit or not staying where you're supposed to stay. Sometimes that's due to anxiety. And so that might look like what people call as defiant behavior. And so this is just the same thing I showed before, but in a different schematic. So here's the really good question that I think a lot of people ask me. Well, can't I just like wait? Why do we have to deal with this now? Won't she just grow out of it? Didn't you just tell me that separation is normal? Yes. But the risks of not treating really clinically interfering separation anxiety, so meaning in another way, if I like not addressing something that we now know is a problem, there's a lot more risk to waiting and a lot of benefit to intervening. So meaning even a little bit of anxiety, there's lots of really great things you can do to help your child be brave and help you tolerate being brave, and it's not harmful. It's actually really helpful for parent skills. It's really great for increasing what we call distress tolerance, which is just a fancy way of saying managing feeling really uncomfortable. And it actually can help us handle things that might pop up in the future. So meaning
So
if we
I
know
have a child that's having that has problem separation anxiety and maybe has some of the features of separation anxiety disorder, by getting engaged and involved with this challenge could really be helpful to the
it
child.
could,
Just
it could really be helpful. And the cool thing is these skills can map onto other things. So meaning if we navigate bravely getting on the bus by, let's say, first going out with mom and dad all the way to the bus, and then having mom and dad like stand 5 feet away, and then eventually going out with our older sibling. The cool thing is we can use those strategies for maybe managing going to a new summer camp, or feeling fearful about bugs, or feeling fearful about other things, because the strategies are really the same. So I think that's kind of the cool part. And adults, if you want to, because I think that adults make really good models, is we can actually say, hey, I don't like crowded places, let's say, but I could use these skills to practice being in crowded places also, because the skills are actually very helpful for adults too. So what do I do? This is kind of like I think our big moment. What do I do? It's called exposure. And I like these keep calm and face your fears. So exposure is kind of a cool thing, right? There's lots of research on what exposure is, and we're not going to talk about all the research and academic kind of stuff, but what it is doing something on purpose and more than one time that causes distress. Now, most people would say, this seems like a very bad idea, right? So if I said, again, like the subway example, but I just told you I think that subways are very germ infested, and I also think they're very crowded, and that really makes me quite nervous. Why would I go on a subway if that's distressing to me? Well, because actually repeated exposure or repeated practice in kind of a planned way and in an incremental way gives us practice doing something and mastering and conquering it. Now,
I like your example about the child going on the bus for the first time.
Right?
And the way you came up really quickly with some ideas about, well, how could you make that into smaller, manageable steps for the child? And even a small step is still, she's facing her fear.
Exactly. And
that's what you call exposure.
The key thing with exposure is it has to be planful, and it has to be repeated, right? So there's this idea of like wash, rinse, and repeat. You can't just say, well, you did it once, so now do it forever. Because if I told you I didn't go on the subway like hundreds and hundreds of times, it would be really unreasonable to say, well, Rachel, just go on the subway tomorrow. You did it once, now just go. And it also would be unfair to say, well, you're going to go on the subway and you're going to love it. You're going to think it's so much fun and fabulous, and you're going to end up being a subway guru. That's actually not true. I might never actually love it, but if a subway is a part of life, there's a good reason to get comfortable with the discomfort of going on one, but it doesn't mean I'm going to love it. And so sometimes parents might say, oh, don't worry, this is not scary, which we don't want to tell kids, right? Because if it's scary to them, it's scary. And we're not going to try to convince them that they're going to love it. But we also, as adults, have to realize if a child hasn't been, for example, sleeping on their own for many months off and on, one night is not going to be sufficient to practice. So exposure is repeated and incremental.
Right. So it's planned, doing it in small steps. And then the big point that you're making beautifully is it really needs repetition.
It needs repetition, and something that I think is in a later slide, reinforcement. So meaning, for an adult, if I, again, using my subway example, if I said I have to get on the subway because now I work all the way downtown and it's just too expensive or too long to walk and too expensive to take via, I could in my mind think about the consequences of what would happen if I racked up all these taxi bills and all those things. But a child can't say, let me think about this. I need to do this now because this is a key part of my development. That doesn't really work that way. So we have to.
5-year-old's not going to think that way.
No. And so you have to use praise, real praise, like that was great getting on the bus. And we often need to use things like rewards or small prizes, which I have never worked with a child who became addicted to praise or addicted to small rewards. And I'm saying small rewards. I don't mean if you get on the bus tomorrow, I'll take you to Disney World, but like small things that help them see sort of like I'm working on this and it has a goal to it and I can kind of benefit from it in the short term.
Yeah.
So this goes back to
stickers and gold stars.
Amazing. Stickers and gold stars are great. For some kids, the stickers itself are enough. And for some kids, the sticker and star are tokens for a real thing. Like it could be chocolate chip pancakes for breakfast, or it could be
if I get enough of them.
Or trip to the movies, or special extra reading time with mom or dad, or sleepover at grandma's, or a Lego set. But sometimes the praise is enough, and sometimes the sticker is enough, and sometimes we need a little more than that. So this kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, why separation anxiety is so hard, and really why anxiety is hard. Because helping is our natural instinct as a parent, and we really want to decrease our child's distress. And so what happens is negative reinforcement is just a fancy way of saying, it's time to go out to the bus, and I have 2 nephews, and one of my nephews actually struggled going out to the bus with his brother because he really was having some separation anxiety and wanted my sister to take him. So negative reinforcement works like this. One, the child starts crying and distressed and says, I don't want to go with my brother. I want you to take me. And rather than saying like, I'll watch from the window and you go out with your brother, the mom in this situation might say, fine, just forget it. Older brother, you go on the bus and I'll take the little one myself.
So that was avoidance.
That's avoidance. And it actually sends this message to the little one. See, you really like, thank goodness mom stepped in because you really need her to help you in this situation. So you feel better. And the mom kind of feels better because that anxious moment passed, but it actually reinforces, and not in a good way, the likelihood of that same thing happening again. And so interventions often don't work, not because they're not good interventions, but because often these are the 2 things that happen. Either we tried it for a few days and it was going okay, but then we kind of backslid and we stopped practicing, or we bit off more than we can chew. So I often will tell parents, you can't say to a child who's been sleeping in your room intermittently for 2 years, tonight's the night. That's it. You're in your room tonight. That's biting off more than you can chew. If your kid has been in your room.
Too big of a step.
Way too big of a step. It is much better to do a very, very small step that you can consistently do, wash, rinse, repeat, reinforce, and go to a next step than do the tonight's the night. Because I'll tell you, tonight won't be the night. Tonight will be the night that it ends the same way it's been because it's too big of a step. And so, for example, like laying with your child till they fall asleep, maybe the first step is just sitting in a chair next to the bed where your child's falling asleep, but you're not in the bed, is a great first step. Or going with them to change their clothes, maybe standing in the doorway while they change their clothes rather than going all the way into the room is a great first step. But if you just say, today you're going upstairs and getting your pajamas on and I just am not coming up, if you've been going with your child to change their clothes off and on for months and months, it's probably not going to work to just say today's the day. So let's talk a little bit about very specific things that parents can do. Parents, and when I say parents, I do mean like all caregivers. So this could be grandma, this could be grandpa, this could be babysitter, this could be older sibling. I work with a lot of older siblings who are actually sometimes better than adults at helping. One way is from an early age. Now, from an early age, those games like peekaboo and hide and seek are actually really awesome for practicing separations. Now, it sounds a
That's
little
right.
weird.
Those are examples of separation, but they're incorporated in play.
Exactly. But it's kind of a cool way to navigate. I'm here, but I'm like here and I'm back and I'm right. So for an infant, those games actually help them through lots of really great parts of child development. So it's great to start in the beginning as you intend to be later. You can also start with little separations and build from there. So I'll use my nephew as another example. My youngest nephew still really struggles with some separations. And so an example of what might happen is he comes over to my house and my sister and I are schmoozing in the kitchen and he says, I want a snack. And we say, go ahead and go get one. And he says, come with me. Now, is it that hard to get up and stop what you're doing and go with him to the pantry? Not really, but it's also not necessary. Like, you've been to my house hundreds of times and mom and I are talking. And so a great way is to say the cabinet is over there, which is actually like in a different room. Go get it and we'll be here, which is a little bit more work than the sure, I'll just go with you to get the snack. But it sends him the message. Again, I have to say to Ellie Lebowitz, who from Yale, he has this great way of saying, like, sending this message of like, I love you very much and I know you can do it. Sort of like, I know this is hard for you to go to the cabinet on your own, but go to the cabinet on your own because I know you can do it. And then when he goes, you say like, great, getting a snack. And so in this example, I remember he was like, come with me, come with me, come with me. And I actually said, you stay here. And I went to the pantry and made sure that the container was at a level that he could reach so that it wasn't going to be a problem once he went to the pantry. And then I came back and I said, okay, now go to the pantry and get it all by yourself. And the cool thing was I knew he could reach it because I already moved it. But then we went back to the kitchen. So he practiced going and getting it by himself.
And you made it, you found a way of making it into a smaller step for him to do.
And so things like that, like go upstairs. So we're going to practice the going into your room game, right? So go upstairs and just get your pajamas and bring them back down here or bring them over here. Or I forgot my phone in my room. You go up and then count to 20 and come back. So these are all very small practices. The other thing is sharing the load. And so what that means is often what happens is one caregiver takes the burden, not because the other caregiver is not being fair, but because oftentimes, and not because the child doesn't like the other person, but they tend to like do the separation dance with one more than the other. And then what happens is like, I only want dad at bedtime, or I only want mom at bedtime. And then that parent does that because it's just so much easier and more distress if it's the other way. But it's actually really important to say, well, actually, mom and dad each want a turn. So today it's mom's turn, tomorrow it's dad's turn. Now, that's not always possible with working parents and schedules, but meaning you want to get in the practice of sharing. You don't want to just have one person doing the separation dance because of the anxiety.
I love the way you describe this exposure work as the separation dance.
It kind of is a dance, right?
Cool. Especially when you bring in the praise and the rewards, and the stickers, that it can be playful.
And so we want to also think about the use of babysitters, nighttime routine, and drop-off as potential moments of separation anxiety, but also really great intervention moments, right? So I have a family that I've worked with before where I didn't actually prescribe, but I said, I really want you guys to go out. If it's expensive to get a babysitter, I totally understand that, but like, you got to work this in because your child really needs practice with separations. I actually sent mom on a walk every other night because we just really needed to get her out of the house. So there are ways to do this with no cost. There are ways to, practice this in a regular way. A word about accommodating versus enabling. Again, those are kind of fancy words, but the difference is accommodating is doing what's necessary at that time based on what the child can handle, and enabling is doing more than is needed. So if my son said, lay with me at bedtime until I fall asleep, I would, and I did, that would be really enabling because he's really capable of falling asleep on his own. If a child is in the process of navigating sleep on their own and the temporary step is to sit in the doorway for 15 minutes, that's a wonderful step if that's what your child needs in the moment, and it's an intermediary to figuring out what the next step on the bravery ladder is. Similarly, I think that like the bus example is the same thing. Once your child's able to get on the bus by themselves, then that's what they should do. And it's not necessary to go backwards. Now, sometimes we have to take a temporary like step back, like after a vacation can be very hard for kids with separation anxiety. And so maybe we say, oh, that was a really long vacation. So today I'm going to walk halfway to the bus again just to give a little bit of practice. But then we go back to where we were.
Okay.
So again, importance of models is, again, this idea that it's great to tell your kid what we want them to do, but we also want to model the behaviors ourselves. And so the way you can do that, one, is just to talk about your emotional experience. So meaning to start incorporating just language about feelings. And it doesn't mean you have to talk about your feelings all the time. What it means is you can come home and say, you know, I was really frustrated today and here's why. And then you show your child how you solved the problem. Like, I was really frustrated because the train was really late. And I was feeling kind of angry because I wanted to come home and this train wasn't moving. But then I said to myself, well, it'll move eventually. So maybe I will read my book instead of feeling angry. So like that would be an example. Another would be, I was feeling really nervous today and here's why. And then here's what I did to get over that worry. So it's actually really helpful for our kids to hear in an age appropriate way. You wouldn't come in and say, oh my goodness, my coworker was tough. You know, you say things that are appropriate, but we want to lead.
Like maybe using I statements that I felt this way and
Yep.
naming, like you said, age appropriate, maybe naming emotions that the child would understand what I'm talking about.
Absolutely.
What did I do? How did I cope with it?
And kids like to hear how you got over something, right? And so you can lead by example. And it doesn't just mean, oh, I was afraid of that when I was little and then I got over it, but actually sharing something real. And between two parents or grandparents or a babysitter and a mom, you probably have a few examples in your repertoire of things that you've overcome through practice. So here's just a couple other examples, and we've talked about this a little bit throughout the talk. But so here's a bedtime kid on the left-hand side. So it's really great to have routines. Kids like routines. It actually helps them navigate what to expect in life, right? And we all have routines too. Like next to my desk, I have a schedule of my printout for the day. That's because it helps me organize what's happening. What I think is we have to be flexible. So I like routines that are flexible. What I mean is, I don't mean bedtime could be 8 o'clock, could be 9 o'clock, could be 10 o'clock. But what I mean flexible is sometimes we have time for 3 books and sometimes 2, or like sometimes we have this, you know, sometimes we wear these pajamas and sometimes we wear those pajamas. We don't have to be rigidly adherent to a routine, but routines are helpful. And so this is an example of bedtime, right? Where there was just a lot of coming out of the bed, refusal to stay in the room. Let's say Johnny is getting very upset and now everybody's tired and nobody's doing well. And so the idea is incremental reward for staying longer and longer in bed. And it's always better to start smaller than you think you need, because we really want to catch the behavior positively. So meaning maybe you think it's easier.
We want the child to feel like he succeeded instead of failed.
Yes, and we want the parent to feel successful too. So let's say you just think the kid can stay in their bed, but really they just keep coming out. You actually, and I've done this before myself, where I have stairs in my house and my son was coming up and down and up and down. So I actually started in the doorway, right? So you actually might start with yourself in the doorway for maybe several days. Now, the important part is you can't be too interesting. So because most kids really want their parents' attention. So sitting in the doorway at bedtime does not mean time for a conversation. It means Jackson, put your body on your bed and I'm going to sit in the doorway. And you're not really looking at your child and you're not talking to them, but you're just sitting there.
You're practicing, or he's practicing meeting the challenge of separation.
But I liked what you said. You actually are both practicing.
Yeah.
And then you have to give praise. Great staying in your bed. And then the hard thing is you have to praise probably in the morning, because you're not going to go wake them up and say, that was really great that you stayed asleep. Now wake up and let's play. And so then you would move a little bit further. So in my case, I moved to the stairs. And was it hard for me? Did I want to be down in the kitchen or watching TV? Yes. But it was much more successful to do incremental steps and eventually get in the bed, good night, right? So all the hugging, kissing, stories, cuddling happens before this bedtime stuff.
From some of these examples that you're giving, there's a lot of creativity that can come into helping come up with what would be a good step that my child has some challenge to it, but something that my child can do.
And I think kids can be, the older kids can definitely help. Younger kids really can't. You can't ask a 4-year-old, what are your opinions about this plan? Like, you really kind of have to just lead with what the plan is. So here's a child at drop off. There's lots of clinging and protesting. And so the idea is that we're going to reward for longer and longer time in the classroom. Now, this would necessitate school being on board, but a conversation with a teacher goes a long way. And I think if a child is having a lot of distress staying at school, the school is likely also invested in helping. And so the idea would be, we don't want to carry the child. We don't want to drag the child. We don't want to try to have too much conversation. We actually want to pay attention to the behaviors we want to see. Like, great standing next to me, great walking into the classroom, and really like ignoring, which is very hard, the minor things like whining and protesting. And you're just modeling, have a great day, I'll see you later. And we're getting stickers and rewards, and we're sort of fading the process. So here's an example of like a younger kid's point sheet, and the older kids wouldn't have this. So you could replace this 4-year-old at drop off with an 8-year-old at the bus. It would just look a little bit different. So it might be that what I said before, parent walks right to the bus and actually walks with the child to get onto the bus. And then a few days later, they stand 5 feet away and watch as the child gets on the bus. And then maybe several days later, the older sibling comes out. And so the idea is that it's incremental and stepwise. And maybe the chart looks like this, or maybe the chart is for an older kid, so just has check boxes. Or here's another one I just have on my desk that looks like, you can buy these online, where you just put, get on the bus at the top and you put check marks or stars. And so really, here are some other examples of things that help and hinder. So talking matter-of-factly about things, helpful. Avoiding talking about things, not helpful. Now, there's a difference. There's a fine line here. Saying there is school tomorrow is a fact. Having a lengthy conversation about school tomorrow at 8:59 before bedtime, not super helpful. So we want to balance giving information and being sort of matter of fact, but also thinking about when we're having the conversation. And so I'll just pull out a few, because I know we're kind of coming to the end of our time. But praising approaching is just a fancy way of saying, if our goal is get on the bus by yourself, we want to give good attention to everything that comes close to that as we're working on it. So like, I really liked how, even though it was a Monday and it's hard on Mondays, you got on the bus with a little bit, like you got on the bus, I'm not saying it eloquently, I'll start back. Like maybe saying it was really hard to get on the bus on a Monday, and you did. And I was standing in the middle of the driveway, you didn't like that too much, but that was really great. So even though we haven't quite gotten on the bus alone yet, we're getting there. Or I love how you stayed in your bed and I was sitting on the stairs. Like, that's getting close to where we were at, where our goal is.
If I can just repeat some of the things that I've been hearing, that it sounds like some of the keys to helping the child with these challenges is coming up with some small steps lots of repetition, and lots of praise and rewards for the
Yes,
child.
absolutely. And some of the things we don't want to do is miss opportunities to praise approach. So what we tend to do is, if everything's going great, we just like, let's just get through the moment. But we want to actually look for opportunities where it was like, hey, you know what I noticed? I was on the phone during bedtime and you like got in bed and laid down, and when I came in there, you were like all ready for me. That was so awesome how you did that. We might just think, why even mention it? Let's just don't say anything. But you actually want to praise those moments rather than saying, why was that so hard last night? We did that, it was okay on Saturday, and why was it so hard on Sunday? We want to flip it and pay attention to the great stuff and kind of minimize the minor stuff. The other thing is there's a very big difference between you have a babysitter and saying, have fun with Alexis, I'll see you later. There's a difference between that and I'm gonna go now, okay? So I'm gonna go now, okay, is really doesn't sound very.
So that's your ambivalent.
It's ambivalent, but also, are you really asking your child, is it okay if I leave? I don't think so. I think that comes from a place of anxiety. So what we want to say is, have fun, I'll see you later, because we want to send that message of like, I love you, I know this is hard, but I know you can do it.
Yeah.
So we want to be like definitive rather than hedgy about it. And we don't want to underestimate our child's ability to cope, because I think we miss an opportunity. So again, my nephew is practicing sleepovers and he slept over the other night, and I for sure praised the fact that he wanted to sleep on his own in the guest room in a big bed by himself. And when he came in and said, oh, I forgot to call mommy to say goodnight, in my mind, I actually, admittedly in my mind, was like, uh-oh, this might not go so well. But I was like, oh my goodness, we did forget. Let's call her. And then he said goodnight. And then I was like, okay, goodnight. Gotta go. And we kind of kept it short and sweet. And then that was the end of that. But if I said, oh my goodness, we forgot. Are you scared? Do you want to go home? Are you feeling a little bit unsure about the sleepover? It probably would have tanked. So we want to be careful about our language. And so here's just the do's and don'ts. Do model, provide factual information about what's going to happen, answer questions. You're not picking me up today, right? I'm going home with Aunt Susie. Yeah, that was good remembering. You are. I have a meeting today, and Aunt Susie's going to pick you up. Praise positive opposites, meaning the opposite of whining, being calm. The opposite of protesting at bedtime, staying in your bed. And we don't want to lie or sneak out or enable. So the idea of just like, I'll just pretend that I was here and then I left is not a good idea, because it kind of is the secret rather than saying, well, yes, I am leaving because that's not a secret, and I'll see you when I get back because I'm going to come back. So again, things like confirming dismissal plans once is reasonable, but we don't want to confirm, like for older kids, I'll see you at 3:00. The difference, what I would call reassurance, over reassurance, would be, I'll see you at 3:00. Well, what time? Like 2:59 or 3:01? Well, it will be 3. And then going back and forth and back and forth. We want to give information once, and that's really all we really need to do. And we want to model resilient and coping behavior. And things like for little kids, transitional objects like a stuffed animal or a special toy in the backpack, those things are fine.
Oh, that's a great idea for helping the child with some smaller steps.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of things that become very distracting. So meaning having something in your backpack that's helpful, great. Having a huge thing on your desk that's going to distract you and everyone around you, it's probably not so helpful. For older kids also, having excessive phone communication actually just makes things worse. And so what I would say for that, just as like kind of a last tip, would be, let's say your child's calling you a lot from the nurse, like every day and multiple times a day. A first step might be to have a planned phone call at lunchtime. And I would say, regardless of how the child's doing, So we don't want to make it contingent on if the child's really anxious, they call you, because they've been calling you when they're anxious before. We actually say, for now, at noon or right before recess, we're going to have a 2-minute phone call and be like, hi, I'm really proud of you for staying in school. See you later. Bye. Which is different than
So
the
that's
phone
using
call.
the phone call as a way of making it into a smaller step for the child
Right.
as compared to, I got this phone and I'm going to use it for reassurance.
Right. Or I call you when I need you, and then the nurse calls you when the child is in distress, which is fine. But for the kid who's calling multiple times a day, we actually want to remove that and say, let's just have a planned call and we'll check in for just 2 minutes. Because probably if the child's been going to the nurse every day, they're not ill. And this, like, I'm assuming that the medical issue is not a problem. We could start by having a planned check-in and then reducing that.
Yeah, very good.
So and then I think just the last thing I'll say is, let's say you've tried all these strategies and things are still not going so well. Sometimes seeking professional help, like we talked about at the beginning, like when you showed ADAA.org and finding a treating professional, when things are persisting, meaning this has been happening now for numerous weeks, if you notice any changes in your child's appetite or their sleep or really like their behavior, like my child is not a cranky child and they're really, really irritable, or they're feeling really, really sad, it's sort of like moving to the point of this is something we really feel like we can't tolerate or fix on our own, then you want to reach out to a mental health professional like a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a clinical social worker, and someone that specializes in working with kids and adolescents. And I think that that's it.
Good. Can you scroll down to that resource page?
Yes, absolutely. I am going
as we wind up.
Yes. Oh my goodness. I don't know what's happening. It's not for some, I just
direction.
froze for some reason, but it's have no fear. Technology will come back. Give me 1 second.
Okay.
And I will send you to that resource.
Yeah, so while Dr. Busman is bringing that up on the screen, I just want to say how much we appreciate you doing this presentation.
Oh, my pleasure.
Just really, really fabulous material.
Thank you.
Encourage, oh, here we go.
Can you see that?
On the screen. Yeah, so here are some resources that Dr. Busman is recommending. At the bottom, you have the 2 websites, childmind.org and ADAA.org.
And I will say that some of those, the what to do when so there's one, What to Do When You Worry Too Much by Dawn Hubner, and the What to Do When You Don't Want to Be Apart. These are kind of great, I wouldn't say books you buy for your child and just give it to them. It's a book that you could work with your child. They're cognitive behavioral therapy workbooks that can actually be really helpful in providing some tips and tools for parents and kids.
Yeah, so I want to suggest to our viewers, you could tap your pause and take a moment and maybe write some of these down.
That's a great idea.
Wonderful.
And I really appreciate you having me so much.
Yeah, thanks again, and thanks everybody for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.